Alright, hi guys. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about hypothesis and variables. Now, many of you already know about the hypothesis and you understand about variables, but I want to make sure that we're very clear as far as what we need to be doing when we're talking about hypothesis and a variable this year in science. So, one thing I want to make sure we understand is that there's a difference between a prediction and a hypothesis. And it's very important that we understand the difference between these two terms. When we talk about hypothesis, a hypothesis is an educated guess, as many of you guys know, but that we need to make sure we understand it has to be able to be tested. A hypothesis is something that we can test using an experiment, an investigation, and so forth. Whereas a prediction is something that you just simply your statement of what you think is going to happen. So a hypothesis in this class is an educated guess or an educated statement of what you think is going to happen, and that it can be tested by using an experiment. So, when we talk about hypothesis this year, we have to make sure that it's something that we can test. The next thing we're going to be talking about is variables. So, last year, you learned about a manipulated variable, that you change one thing in an experiment. All the other variables need to stay the same. Well, that one thing that you change in the experiment is called an independent variable. Last year you called it a manipulated variable. This year we're going to be calling it an independent variable. So, I want to make sure you're very clear. You already know this. It's just we have now an actual vocabulary term to attach to it. Independent variable is the one thing you change in the experiment. Now, I want to make sure that we're practicing the pause button. If you haven't been pausing already, you need to make sure that you're doing so. So this would be a great time to go ahead and pause to write down the information. Now, the dependent variable, this year we're going to be talking about many variables, but independent variable is the one thing you change. Now we're going to be talking about the dependent variable, and that's the one thing or the variable that we're going to be observing during the experiment. It's oftentimes the variable that you're writing information down. So let's say, for example, we're going to be talking about maybe a bubble solution. My kids did blowing a lot of bubbles, and we had several different bubble solutions. So one of the things Ty asked is, Mom, which one is the better solution? So let's think about that. If Ty was to do an experiment where he's testing different solutions, bubble solutions that he can buy from a store, to find out which one will produce the most number of bubbles, what would be his independent variable? Pause for a second and think about it. See if you can figure it out. What's the one thing that he would change in the experiment? If you said the type of solution, you would be correct. His independent variable in that experiment was the kind of solution. He switched. He switched and changed the different solutions. Now, what would be his dependent variable in that situation? Pause for a second and see if you can get it. If you said the number of bubbles, because he was wanting to get the most number of bubbles, that would be correct. That's what he was going to be counting. Now, obviously, that experiment he would have to do a lot of things to make sure that they are controlled. So he'd have to blow the same way, he'd have to make sure that the wand is the same distance apart from his mouth. So he has a lot of variables he'd have to make sure are the same, but if he was able to control the experiment, we would have one independent variable, which was the variable he changed, the types of solutions, and then he'd have a dependent variable, which was counting the number of bubbles that would respond to that. Let's take a look at another example. So let's say that Kelly is in the classroom and she's working on a paper airplane, and she's wanting to see how many clips, how the weight would affect the distance that the airplane traveled. She's thinking that if she goes ahead and adds more weight, that the actual airplane won't travel as far. So she decides to conduct an experiment. If you think about it, independent variable, what's the one thing she changes? That's the weight. She's going to be adding clips to her airplane. The dependent variable, what she's going to be observing during the experiment, is how far it travels. So we can identify independent and dependent variables very easily as long as we know what the words mean. That's our way of being able to tell if she has a good experiment. If she's changing only one thing, if she has only one independent variable, and that we can clearly understand what she's going to be observing, her dependent variable. Make sure that you're ready for class when you come with all of your notes about independent variable, dependent variable, as well as hypothesis, because we're going to be using those in the next couple of weeks. I'll see you in class. Bye.